when I was first arrested and began going to court, he told us that there were 2 guns in the state's evidence, and the gun that I had wasn't a murder weapon. As far as the ballistics test coming back saying that the gun in the state's evidence is a murder weapon, I don't know. You know, it may be, but what I know is that the gun I had the day that I left my apartment is not the murder weapon.
On September 14th, 2005, inside the Huntsville unit in Texas, Frances Newton took her final steps toward the execution chamber. She was 40 years old, quiet, steady, and about to become the first black woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. Her crime, according to the state, killing her husband, her 7-year-old son, and her nearly 2-year-old daughter for life insurance money. But here's the problem. From the very beginning, the evidence wasn't clear. A handgun linked to Frances raised more questions than answers, and whispers of a second gun, one that might not have been hers, were never fully investigated. So what happens when a life ends while the truth remains unsettled? To understand that, we have to go back to 1987. Before she became a headline, Frances Newton was just Frances, a 22-year-old mother of 2 in Houston, married to Adrian Newton, raising 7-year-old Alton and baby Farah, who was only 21 months old, the kind of person neighbors barely noticed. Friends described her as soft-spoken, someone who blended into the background rather than stood out. But in April 1987, everything changed. Within just a short span, Frances would go from being seen as a mother holding her family together to standing accused of destroying it completely. Prosecutors would claim she was cold, deliberate, willing to sacrifice the 3 people closest to her in exchange for money from insurance policies. The contrast was staggering. 2 completely different images of the same person colliding in one story. That collision begins on the night her husband and both young children were found dead. The moment Frances's life was pulled into a direction from which there was no return. The story turns in the spring of 1987. By then, Frances and Adrian Newton's marriage was strained. Adrian had developed a reputation for drug use. Heroin was mentioned in court later.
At that time, I know that my husband owed money to this guy he was selling drugs for. The guy is not a figment of my imagination, you know. That was real, that was going on. You know, and it had my husband so concerned at times. Sometimes we would come home and Alton would come out of his room and say, "Mom, Dad, asleep under the bed," you know, under his bed. We wouldn't see his car anywhere, but he'd be under the bed asleep, you know. So that was something that was going on. And of course, when I find out that my husband and children were murdered, that was my first thought.
The couple's finances were under heavy pressure. Arguments over money, lifestyle choices, and responsibility became common. Frances, according to those close to her, was frustrated by his behavior and increasingly worried about the safety of their children. Just weeks before the tragedy, Frances made a decision that would later be used against her in the harshest way. She purchased life insurance policies on Adrian, herself, and the children. Altogether, the policies totaled around $50,000, with Frances listed as the beneficiary. At the time, she explained it as a precaution, a way to protect her family if something happened. But in court, prosecutors would transform that choice into what they called her motive for murder. On the night of April 7th, 1987, police were called to the Newtons' apartment in northwest Houston. What they found inside was devastating. Adrian Newton, 23, was dead from a gunshot wound. 7-year-old Alton was also shot and killed. And baby Farah, just 21 months old, was found dead in her crib. The home that had once echoed with family noise was silent now, the scene marked by sudden and brutal violence. The community's reaction was immediate. Neighbors struggled to believe such horror could unfold in their midst. But as investigators worked the case, their suspicion narrowed quickly. Frances had been the last person known to be with her family that evening. She told police she left briefly and returned to find the terrible scene. Yet detectives weren't convinced. When they learned about the freshly purchased insurance policies, suspicion hardened into a narrative. Frances Newton, they said, had killed her husband and both children to collect $50,000 in payouts. The speed of that shift was jarring. Frances, a woman seen by many as quiet and reserved, had gone overnight from grieving mother and wife to accused killer. The leap was enormous, and it begged a deeper question. Were investigators following evidence or fitting the evidence into a theory they were already sold on? That question would soon be funneled into one crucial piece of physical evidence, a handgun police believed tied her directly to the crime. To prosecutors, it was the missing link between motive and murder. To Frances, it was the start of a nightmare she could never escape. Once the bodies were discovered in April 1987, investigators wasted little time focusing on Frances Newton. To them, the combination of life insurance policies worth $50,000 and her presence in the home that night painted a clear picture. They believed she had both motive and opportunity, but motive alone doesn't convince anyone. The police needed something physical, something that could tie Frances to the crime. That evidence, they claimed, came in the form of a handgun. Days after the murders, a .25 caliber pistol was recovered, one that Frances had access to. Prosecutors said it was the very weapon used to kill Adrian Alton and baby Farah. The detail was explosive. A grieving wife and mother linked to a hidden gun. It sounded like the missing puzzle piece. But here's where the cracks in the story begin to show. Ballistics testing linked the pistol to the bullets in the victims, but experts also raised concerns about how the weapon was handled. The gun had been stored improperly before analysis, raising questions about contamination. And more troubling, later reports surfaced suggesting that a second gun might have been collected early in the case, but it was never fully examined or presented in court. If that was true, then the narrative tying Frances to one weapon could suddenly fall apart. Think about that for a moment. A woman facing the death penalty, and there might have been another weapon at play that was never scrutinized. That single detail changes the entire weight of the case. Did investigators overlook it? Did they dismiss it? Or was it deliberately buried because it didn't fit the story prosecutors wanted to tell? The investigation leaned heavily on circumstance. Frances's decision to take out insurance policies became the centerpiece. But here's another layer. It wasn't unusual for families under financial stress to seek coverage, and the policy amounts weren't enormous. Still, prosecutors used it as proof of premeditation. To them, $50,000 was enough for a mother to destroy her family. To others, that theory stretched belief. Frances herself denied ever pulling the trigger. She maintained that she left the apartment briefly and returned to find her family already dead. Yet her words were overshadowed by the prosecution's confident framing of the evidence. From the outside, it looked airtight. A gun, insurance money, and a woman with a reason. But from the inside, the foundation was thinner than it appeared. Missing or mishandled evidence, shaky forensic work, and a story that seemed to leap ahead of the facts. All of it created an uneasy shadow over what would come next. And that shadow followed the case into the courtroom, where Frances Newton's fate would be decided not by questions of doubt, but by the certainty of a jury that believed it had heard enough. By the time Frances Newton stood trial in October 1988, more than a year had passed since the murders. The courtroom in Harris County was packed. Reporters filled benches, sketch artists took notes, and curious onlookers leaned forward, eager to see the woman who had been painted as a wife and mother who chose money over family. The prosecution's case was direct and forceful. They told the jury that Frances had coldly executed her husband and both her children to claim $50,000 in life insurance. To hammer the point home, they displayed the policies again and again, reminding jurors that Frances had taken them out just weeks before the killings. The .25 caliber handgun was presented as the smoking gun, literally and figuratively, and the ballistics testimony gave it an air of certainty. But here's what's striking. No one had seen Frances pull the trigger. No fingerprints tied her directly to the gun. The case was circumstantial, built on motive, timing, and the story prosecutors told around those insurance policies. Still, the way they framed it left the jury with a chilling image of a mother willing to destroy her own bloodline for cash. On the other side, the defense struggled. Frances's court-appointed lawyer had little time and fewer resources. He raised questions about the integrity of the evidence, about the possibility of another weapon, about whether investigators had rushed to judgment. But those arguments often landed softly compared to the prosecution's sharp narrative. Jurors were being told a clean, simple story: greed, gun, murder. The defense's message sounded fractured by comparison. Frances herself sat quietly through much of it. When she spoke, she maintained her innocence, saying she had not killed her family. To her supporters, she came across as calm and consistent. To the state, that calm was presented as something darker, the face of someone unbothered by what she had done. The jury deliberated for less than a full day. When they returned, the verdict was guilty. Frances Newton was sentenced to death. The courtroom went silent, the weight of the decision sinking in. A mother convicted of murdering her husband and both young children, now marked for execution. But beneath the surface, the unease remained. The gun had questions tied to it. The insurance motive seemed thin for such an unthinkable act, and the defense never had the resources to fully investigate the cracks in the state's case. It left one unavoidable tension. Was the jury swayed more by confidence than by certainty? With that verdict, Frances's fate was sealed, but her story was far from over. Because over the next 17 years, lawyers, activists, and even scientists would continue to circle back to one haunting idea, that the evidence may not have been as strong as the state claimed, and that battle would play out in the long, exhausting years of appeals and delays that followed.
The insurance had nothing to do with anything. I got that for a savings plan. Claudia said she told them that, but it was made to be out of a big deal. 6 months prior, she had talked to me about the insurance. My dad had talked to me about insurance. I don't know. I don't feel like J.J. Freeze himself had anything to do with that, but somewhere in the course of things, I think the police decided, okay, well, let's not talk about this and let's, build this up.
After her conviction in 1988, Frances Newton was sent to death row. For most, a guilty verdict means the end, but for Frances, the fight was just beginning. Her lawyers attacked the case immediately. The gun evidence was shaky, no clear chain of custody, questionable testing, and then the bombshell, whispers of a second weapon, one that was never presented in court. If true, that changes everything. If prosecutors had evidence pointing away from Frances and buried it, then the jury never heard the whole story. This wasn't a technicality. This was the difference between guilt and innocence. For 17 years, the appeals dragged on. Frances's lawyers demanded modern forensic testing, ballistics, gunshot residue analysis, anything that could resolve the doubts. Supporters rallied outside courthouses. Anti-death penalty groups took up her cause. Even organizations that rarely intervened said her trial left too many questions unanswered. But Texas kept pushing forward. Frances was given an execution date, then another, then a third. Each time, a last-minute stay bought her more time. Days, months, sometimes a year. Each time, the case exploded back into the headlines. By 2005, the reprieve had run out. Her legal team filed desperate motions for new testing, denied. Requests for clemency, rejected. Governor Rick Perry had the power to stop it. He refused. 17 years, countless appeals, every legal avenue exhausted. The final date was set, September 14th, 2005. The state of Texas would execute Frances Newton by lethal injection. The appeals were over. The countdown had begun. By the evening of September 14th, 2005, the appeals were exhausted. Outside the Huntsville unit, the crowd had already chosen sides. Some carried candles and prayed. Others held signs demanding justice for Adrian, Alton, and baby Farah. A few came simply to witness history, the first black woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. Inside, Frances Newton was escorted to a holding cell near the execution chamber. She ordered her final meal: chicken, fresh vegetables, peaches, and a Coke. Simple, ordinary, the kind of meal anyone might eat on a quiet evening. Except this was her last. When the hour came, Frances remained calm. Witnesses described her as steady, almost serene. In her final statement, she said what she had said for 18 years. "I did not kill my family."
There are so many things that I don't know and I don't have answers to, but there are some things that I do know, and that I know that if a jury knew, that they would have come to a different decision. The issue with the ballistics and the gun, they would have found out that the shell casings found there didn't match. the weapon that they're saying is the murder weapon. That still hasn't been brought up in any of the court hearings, you know, and that's a major, that's something I didn't know, but that one of the attorneys working on the case now told me about, that and those are like fingerprints.
For some, that calmness was proof of innocence. How could she face death with such conviction if she were guilty? For others, it was the opposite, coldness, a woman unbothered even now, the same moment. Two completely different truths. Outside, the chanting grew louder. Supporters begged the governor to intervene, pleaded for one more test, one more look at the evidence. But the clock didn't stop. At 6:17 p.m., Frances Newton was strapped to the gurney. The fourth was inserted. The drugs flowed. Within minutes, she was gone. The state had spoken. Justice, they said, was done. But the questions didn't die with her. The second gun, the mishandled evidence, the things that were never fully examined, if anything, they grew louder in the silence. Frances Newton's execution wasn't an ending. It was the start of a question that refuses to go away. Did Texas execute a guilty woman, or did they kill someone while the truth was still buried? After Frances Newton's death, the silence didn't last. Lawyers and activists circled back to the claim that haunted the case from the beginning: the second gun, a weapon possibly tied to the crime, never tested, never presented. If it existed, the jury never knew about it. Journalists re-examined the trial and found cracks everywhere. Frances's defense was underfunded and overwhelmed. The $50,000 insurance motive, the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, seemed impossibly thin. Would a mother really destroy her entire family for that? Critics pointed out what the jury never fully considered. The state's case was built more on story than certainty. And then there was the weight of history. Frances became the first black woman executed in Texas since the Civil War. That fact alone gave her case symbolic power and raised an uncomfortable question. Did the system rush to close the book because it was easier than admitting doubt? Years later, the questions haven't faded. If anything, they've grown sharper. Did Texas execute a guilty woman, or did they kill someone while the truth was still buried? Frances Newton went to her death insisting she was innocent. She became the first black woman executed in Texas in over a century, but her case ended with more questions than answers. Was $50,000 really enough motive to kill a husband and 2 children? Could the jury have reached the same verdict if that possible second gun had been tested? And if doubt exists, even the smallest shadow of it, should the death penalty ever be on the table? Texas carried out the sentence. The state called it justice, but was it? Because here's the thing about execution: there's no taking it back, no retrial, no new evidence that can undo what's been done. Once the injection flows, certainty becomes permanent, even if the truth never was. So I'm asking you, do you believe Frances Newton was guilty, or did Texas execute her without certainty? Comment below. Let's talk about it.